You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 11.
Several kilometers behind Isabelle's bus, a little white car carrying two creatures who did not answer to the description of human beings, and neither of which was the holder of a valid driver's license, was traveling along the narrow mountain road in a jerky and dangerous manner. On two occasions the car almost sailed over the edge and into the valley far below, but Zaw, who was driving the car very casually with only one hand on the steering wheel, was unapologetic. "It's the first time I've driven a car, so there's bound to be a few close shaves, but don't worry, I've got it worked out now," he assured his sister. With his window wound all the way down, the breeze was flattening the fur on his cheeks into circular patterns. Then the sun set, and as the last rays of daylight slipped behind the distant mountains, the treacherous road became dark. Abby stared down into the valley that had become a sea of impenetrable blackness. "Now I really think you should slow down," Abby said, holding onto her firmly fastened seatbelt nervously. "I can't see more than 20 meters ahead." "If Pemba were driving, he would only be able to see 10 meters, Zaw replied. "But I bet you wouldn't complain about him. That's because he drives with both hands on the wheel and at least one foot on the brake," Abby said, "so his inferior human eyes aren't an issue." "Maybe," answered Zaw. "Anyway, we're way behind his bus, so I have to catch up." Abby sighed and said, "It doesn't matter how far behind we get because we know where the bus is going, so we can take our time on the way to Shabrbesi and get there safely." Emphasis on that last part. Zaw grunted to indicate that he had, at least, heard his sister's comments, then swung the car around another corner on the dangerous mountain road and gunned the engine just a little less than usual. Isabelle sighed quietly, wondering how much further it was to Shabrbesi. The sun had set some time ago, shrouding the countryside in darkness. The interior of the bus was dimly lit, and all she could see in the window beside her was her own ghostly reflection in the glass. She didn't hear Laheeti stop alongside her seat and hunker down in the aisle. "I don't reckon it can be much further," he said. "We've been traveling for several hours." The old lady holding the chicken was sitting between Isabelle and Laheeti. When she realized that they wanted to talk to each other, she motioned that she would swap seats with Isabelle. After squeezing past and sitting down beside Laheeti, she smoothed a lock of blonde hair aside from her face and rested her head on his shoulder. "I hope our whole trip in Nepal isn't spent traveling on buses," she sighed. "If we find Nikki Zipster in Shabrbesi, we're going to hop on a bus and go straight back to Kathmandu, I think," Laheeti said. She raised her head to look him in the eye. "Don't say if we find Nikki, I don't like to think of it that way," she admonished. "Okay, when we find Nikki," he replied. "What I mean is, she might just be staying in a lodge in Shabrbesi, so we won't have to go looking in Langtang for her." "Maybe," Isabelle mused. She was quiet for a while and then said, "It's weird. I've never met Nikki, but for some reason I feel like she's my friend. I think it's because we talk about her all the time, but I don't even know what she looks like." "You will when we find her," said Laheeti with half a smile. Isabelle winked at him and said, "You're a fast learner." Then she noticed Pemba, sitting in the seat in front of her, watching them out of the corner of his eye. Pushing herself up straighter, she asked Laheeti, "Did Tom tell you that we've got another person joining our group?" "Another person?" Laheeti asked. "If we get any more, we'll have enough people to book our own bus." Isabelle tapped Pemba on the shoulder and then introduced them both to each other, omitting the fact that Laheeti was a prince who came from a Pacific island. But after shaking hands, Pemba's stare lingered on Laheeti's face and he said, "You look familiar. Are you famous?" "Nah," Laheeti said lightly. "I've just got one of those faces." "You're from the Pacific somewhere, right?" Pemba pressed. "Fiji, Vanuatu, Vavu, one of those islands." Laheeti was impressed that Pemba had even heard of Vavu. Most people hadn't. "You got it in one," he replied. "The Vavu Islands." "The Vavu Islands," Pemba said thoughtfully. "I remember reading something in the news last year about how the Prince of Vavu helped the police catch some thieves who tried to steal the royal crown." He looked from Laheeti to Isabelle and back again. "Now that I think about it," he continued, "there was a blonde-haired girl from England involved too." Pemba smiled broadly and added, "But I guess it's just a coincidence that you look like that prince and have a blue-eyed, blonde-haired girlfriend who comes from England." Appalled, Isabelle and Laheeti stammered hasty denials in unison. "He's not my boyfriend," she blurted out. "She's not my girlfriend," he declared. Isabelle's surprise turned to indignation. Poking Laheeti in his shoulder with little stabbing motions of her finger, she exclaimed, "What? I'm not good enough to be your girlfriend? Is it because you're a prince? Because if that's the reason, it's the worst reason I have ever heard." Laheeti ignored her and explained the situation to Pemba. She's more like my sidekick, he said helpfully. Sidekick, she cried, pretending to laugh. Me and Twig saved your bacon in Japan and I'm your sidekick, like that makes sense. Twigger, the guy sitting back there, and me are looking for a prince for her to marry before she turns 21 years old, Laheeti said. Do you know any? Pemba looked surprised. Do I know any princes? He said with a laugh. No, there are none around here. Like who I marry is any of your business, Isabelle retorted to Laheeti. Then she said, anyway, I'm not getting married before I turn 21, that's way too young. Are you serious about finding Isabelle a prince? Asked Pemba. Not really, Laheeti said. But on our trip to Japan, we managed to introduce her to Prince Toshiro, and we were hoping to introduce her to a member of the Nepalese royal family, but for various reasons, we're, keeping a low profile here in Nepal. You mean the whole yeti thing? Pemba asked carefully. Laheeti's eyebrows shot up questioningly. So Isabelle told you, he said. Pemba nodded. I didn't even need to twist her arm or anything, he replied. Isabelle crossed her arms defensively. It ended up working out for the best because he's going to be our guide in Shabrubesi, she said. They talked for a while about the possible existence of the yeti, and Pemba trenchantly denied that there could be any such creature living in the Himalayas as he had with Isabelle. He wasn't a natural liar, but on this particular topic he spoke with a silver tongue. He had lived with the yeti for virtually all of his life, and he knew how important it was to protect the secret of their existence and the location of Shangri-La. He liked Isabelle and Laheeti, and he could tell they were honest, well-meaning people, but that didn't change the fact that they had to go home disappointed and empty-handed. The council had entrusted him with that job, and he intended to succeed. It was easy to pretend to believe that the yeti weren't real, and truth be told, it was kind of fun. Isabelle and Laheeti were so serious about the purpose of their trip to Nepal that he couldn't resist stirring them up. Any mention that the yeti were just a pipe dream, and they both set to work vigorously trying to convert him into a believer. The harder he argued against the existence of the yeti, the harder they argued for it. He couldn't help but laugh at the situation. Little did they know they were preaching to the choir. I told you, Isabelle said to Laheeti, he's anti-yeti. I never met a more closed-minded person in my life. Laheeti shrugged and said, then he's gonna get a real big shock when we find one. Just then, the chicken which was lying mutely on the old lady's lap woke from its daze and began squawking and flapping its wings in agitation. With a calming hand the old lady patted it gently, but it wasn't to be subdued. I think it knows we're almost there, Isabelle commented. About an hour to go, Pemba replied, and then he inclined his head to one side and sat very still. Isabelle frowned, started to speak, but Pemba wasn't listening to her. Do you hear that? He asked. All I hear is that chicken, she replied. Suddenly Pemba leapt up from his seat, crossed the aisle and leaned close to the dark windows, cupping his hands over his eyes in order to see beyond the black glass. It took his eyes a moment to adjust, and then what he saw made his blood run cold. Oh no, he breathed. He immediately had Burnmaster's attention. What's wrong? He asked, moving down the aisle and pressing his face close to the window. Isabelle heard something that didn't come from the bus or the chicken. It was a deep, visceral rumble that was growing louder and closer by the second. In the moment it took her to realize that something was very wrong. The rumble multiplied in volume until it sounded like 1,000 horses galloping across the roof of the bus. She stared at the ceiling, terrified, wondering if it was an earthquake. Quickly the roar engulfed her senses until she could feel it in her bones. She covered her ears with her hands in vain. What's going on? She howled. Suddenly Gulbenkian was beside her, lifting Laheeti off the ground and wrapping his arms around the young prince protectively. With one giant hand he pressed Isabelle's head down into her lap and roared, without a hint of a stutter, whatever happens, put your arms around your head and stay down. Burnmaster's book lay on the floor, forgotten. Cupping his hands over his eyes like Pemba, he stared out the window in horror. An avalanche of boulders, trees, and mud was tumbling down the mountainside and coming straight towards the bus. For God's sake, stop the bus, he howled, forgetting that the driver spoke no English. We're driving right into it. Pemba was standing next to him in the aisle, his hands braced on the tops of the seats against the wild swaying of the bus. No, we're not, he yelled. Look, he briefly pointed out the back window. It's already behind us. Burnmaster spun around and saw an enormous wave of mud and debris, briefly illuminated by the headlights of a truck following the bus, obliterate the road and engulf everything in its path. The driver of the bus must have seen the same thing in his rear view mirror, because there was a sudden grinding of gears followed by a burst of acceleration. For a moment the carnage behind them started to recede, but then the avalanche increased its fury. We're not going to make it, howled Pemba, diving back into his seat and covering his head with his arms. Hundreds of tons of earth swept down the mountainside and collided with the speeding bus, rolling it over twice and carrying it towards the edge of the precipice and the deep valley below. Trees and rocks pummeled the side of the vehicle, smashing the windows along Isabelle's side and denting it like a tin can. The avalanche completely engulfed the bus, burying it in debris and entombing its terrified occupants. For a moment the driver tried to drive the bus against the rushing mud, but quickly gave up and clung to the steering wheel for grim life. What felt endless was in fact over in moments, and then the roar of the landslide melted away, leaving the small sounds that punctuate the darkness after a disaster. The brittle cracking of glass, the groan of steel under strain, the whimpering and coughing of people still alive. Isabelle's senses recovered one by one, and after a while she became aware of the position of her body. When she unwrapped her arms from around her head, she bumped her elbows on solid objects on either side of her and guessed that she was lying on the floor between two seats. With gentle fingers she probed the soft, feathery thing beneath her cheek and suddenly realized it was the chicken, unmoving now. And then in a rush of terrible understanding she knew she was lying on the old lady, who had somehow, in those horrible moments when the bus was rolling over and over, ended up beneath her. Struggling to lift herself away, she reached out for familiar objects to grasp, but nothing was where it was supposed to be. She opened her eyes and stared, but the interior of the bus was pitch black and she saw nothing. There were scratching sounds around her, perhaps the sounds of people moving, or maybe the sounds of tree limbs rubbing against the metal exterior of the bus. "Laheeti, Tom," she said. "Can anyone hear me? Isabelle, is that you?" A voice asked from the dark, the South African accent unmistakable. She felt a flood of relief. "Tom," she answered. "Are you okay?" "I think so," he said with a groan. "Is everyone else okay?" There was a chorus of weak voices in reply, including some responses in a language that Isabelle presumed was Nepalese. Suddenly everybody was speaking at the same time, asking questions and answering them, seeking to reconnect with the living. Then people were moving in the darkness, trying to stand up, get their bearings, find their companions. They all had torches in their rucksacks, but Burnmaster was the first to find his. Switching it on, he shone the yellow beam around the bus unhappily. "Geez, the whole thing's been rolled over," he muttered to himself. The bus was now on its side, and its occupants, Burnmaster figured there were about a dozen people, not including his own group, were distributed around the interior in awkward positions. Everywhere he moved the torch he saw twisted silhouettes, not all of them moving. He was shocked but not surprised. The bus had been put on spin cycle and this was the disastrous result. He sought out the faces of his companions one by one. Gulbenkian and Laheeti were fine. The giant bodyguard had, once again, done his job of protecting the young prince perfectly. The bus had done 2 flips, but somehow Laheeti and Gull didn't have a mark on them. Isabelle had escaped with a bump on the head and a scratch on her cheek, possibly from the beak of the chicken she had been lying on. And Twigger seemed okay too, though he complained of some pain in his wrist, and it was starting to go a light shade of purple. Burnmaster quietly hoped it wasn't broken because they were a long way from a hospital. He didn't count Pemba as part of his group yet, so it didn't occur to him to find out if the Nepalese boy was okay. Laheeti, Gulbenkian and Twigger managed to find their rucksacks and retrieve their torches, so the bus was filled with bright beams of light flashing in several directions. Isabelle asked Laheeti to bring his torch closer to the unmoving form of the old lady, and she saw that there was blood seeping from a blow to the back of the old lady's head. A closer inspection showed there was a lot more blood underneath her. "I think she's," Laheeti began, letting the unfinished sentence hang in the air. Isabelle nodded and stepped back, her eyes shiny in the torchlight. While Gull worked his way around the bus helping people as best he could, Burnmaster shone his own torch around and took stock of the situation. With the bus lying on its side, the windows were now over their heads and under their feet. His boots crunched on broken glass, several windows on the floor were smashed and several more were badly cracked. He'd been trying to work out what had happened, and as he shone his torch around, he realized that the bus was so dark because it was buried in the landslide. Feeling sick at the thought and deeply worried that this bus had just become their tomb, he pointed the light at the windows over his head and saw that they were all intact, though cracked in places. Brown mud and rocks and tree trunks were pressing down against every square inch of the glass, and he suspected that if just one of the windows over his head broke, the bus would start to slowly fill with mud. Putting that horrible thought to one side, he moved to the front of the bus and checked the windscreen. It too was cracked in several places but unbelievably was still intact. After a while the group stood very close together, with their shoulders touching in the confines of the overturned bus. they decided that in order to conserve batteries, only one torch should be switched on at any given time. Burnmaster started to calculate how many hours of light they would have if they used the torches sparingly, but then he stopped because he didn't really want to know. As they switched off their torches one by one, the bus became incrementally more ominous. The mud could physically crush them, but the darkness was crushing them psychologically. The light brought hope and the darkness brought fear. Twig said what everybody was thinking. "This bus has become a mud submarine, hasn't it?" Burnmaster's concern showed on his pale face. "We do seem to be trapped underneath the landslide," he agreed. "It could be worse," suggested Laheeti. "How so?" asked Isabelle. "We could have gone over the edge," replied Laheeti. "Over the edge of what?" she asked. "Over the edge of the mountain and into the valley below," Laheeti answered. "It's a long way down." "How do you know we haven't?" she said. Laheeti rolled his eyes. "Because the bus only rolled a couple of times," he said. "It didn't fall. If it did, we'd all be a lot flatter right now." "He's right," said Burnmaster. "Instead of pushing us over the edge, the mud from the landslide probably stuck the bus to the road and kept us from going over the edge." "But how are we going to get out of the bus?" asked Isabelle fearfully. "Can we dig our way through the mud?" Burnmaster had been wondering when somebody would ask that question. "I'm not so sure that's a good idea," he said. "If we break one of the windows to try and climb out, the mud might start to flow into the bus and keep flowing in." "You mean it wouldn't stop flowing in?" Isabelle asked. "It would stop when the bus was full of mud," Twig replied dryly, "but that would mean we—" Isabelle began to say, and then she stopped suddenly when she realized what it would mean and swallowed the lump in her throat. "What about if we break the bottom half of the windscreen?" Laheeti suggested. "Maybe the mud wouldn't flow in so much and it would give us a chance to dig through." "If anybody is going to try and dig through, it will be me," declared Gulbenkian. Isabelle stared up at his face, which, lit from below by the torch in Burnmaster's hands, looked menacing. She shivered, so accustomed to Gull's stuttering was she that his deep, unwavering voice somehow emphasized the danger. "The problem is we have no idea how much mud is covering the bus," explained Burnmaster, "so trying to dig through could be a total waste of time. But if we don't try, we'll never know, right?" Isabelle said. Burnmaster shrugged. "It's not for me to say what would or would not work, but if we are going to start breaking windows, I figure we should discuss it with the other people on the bus." "You mean we need to get everybody else to agree?" asked Isabelle, looking around at the Nepalese who were standing in groups. "What if they don't agree? Do we just stand here and wait too?" And she tried to say die, but the word stuck in her throat. There was a cracking sound of glass breaking beneath booted feet, and then a form materialized in the darkness behind Burnmaster. It was Pemba holding something that shone with a blue fluorescent light. When Isabelle realized what the object was, she almost hugged him in relief. "Is that a satellite phone?" she exclaimed. "Don't get too excited," Pemba replied. "I don't think I can get a signal. I've been trying for the last 5 minutes. I figure the mud covering the bus must be too thick." "Can I try?" asked Burnmaster, passing the torch to Gull. Pemba handed the phone to him and leaned against the wall of the bus tiredly. Burnmaster asked what the phone number for emergency services was, and Pemba told him. Holding the phone close to the roof, then low to the floor, then next to several windows, the South African tried in vain for several minutes before handing it back to Pemba. "He's right, I can't get anything either," he said despondently. They all had a turn, but without success. Isabelle's hopes were crushed. Burnmaster tugged on Pemba's sleeve and drew him aside. The conversation was growing increasingly desperate, and he wanted to exclude the 14-year-olds as much as possible. The less they knew about the hopelessness of their predicament, the better. For some reason, it didn't occur to him that Isabelle, Laheeti, and Twigger were just as attuned to the danger of their situation as he was. "Tell it to me straight," he whispered to the Nepalese boy who, 10 minutes ago, he didn't trust at all. "Will Kathmandu or Shabrubesi send out rescue teams when they hear about the landslide, or are we on our own?" "Rescue teams will probably come from Kathmandu, but it will probably take them so long to get here that they'll be too late to help us," Pemba replied grimly. "And I wouldn't be expecting any help from Shabrubesi. They don't have the resources." Burnmaster stared at the floor and shook his head. It looked like somebody was going to have to try and dig their way out after all. "How long do you think we've got before we start running out of oxygen in here?" he asked. "Oxygen's probably not the problem, carbon dioxide's the problem," replied Pemba. "It'll build up in here, and when it gets to a certain level, it'll start to slowly kill everyone." He thought for a while and then said, "We've got maybe 8 or 9 hours. Suddenly, there was a gut-wrenching rumble like the sound of a collapsing building, and the whole bus jerked and lurched forward. There were screams of panic inside the bus and a grinding sound from underneath as it was slowly pushed along the mountain road. Isabelle and Laheeti held onto each other, Gulbenkian held onto them both, and everybody else braced themselves for disaster. But then the rumbling sound subsided, and the slow slide of the bus towards the edge of the mountain stopped again. Burnmaster let go of his handhold and took a deep breath. "We may not have 8 or 9 hours," he muttered, and Pemba nodded in the darkness. When Burnmaster rejoined the group, Isabelle grabbed the torch from Gull and shone it in Burnmaster's face so that she could clearly see his guilty expression. "When you told us about the dangers of this trip to Nepal, you never mentioned landslides," she said angrily. "What?" he blurted out. "Back on Vavu, when you were telling us about all the terrible dangers of this trip," she explained. "You never mentioned landslides, remember?" Despite the hopelessness of their situation, he laughed. "That's true, I don't think I did mention landslides," he agreed. "He did mention avalanches, though," Laheeti said. Isabelle frowned. "Isn't an avalanche just snow?" "No, I think it can be mud too," he said helpfully. "Oh," she said weakly, "I thought it was just snow."
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.